Welcome to Khanversation. I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan, and Salam Alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to all of you who are celebrating and practicing and fasting in this month of Ramadan. As all of you know, that every year in the month of Ramadan, I do 4 special shows on Khanversations. In the past, they have always been about the Quran. So I have spoken to various translators of the Quran, various commentators of the Quran, people who have done research on the Quran. So all the conversations in the month of Ramadan in the past were meditation on the Quran, essentially. So those of you who are interested in watching those, you can go back and look at the playlist, and you will find it there. This time, in this Ramadan, I'm introducing to those of you who are not familiar, 4 important books of the Islamic civilization. They are all non-theological, essentially. They are books which, on the basis of which you could argue that there was indeed a golden age in Islamic philosophical thinking and mystical thinking, in the way Muslim scholars and philosophers struggle to balance the diktats of revelation and the imperatives of reason. And so I have picked 4 books, which I will talk about once a week. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. So Ibn Khaldun is one of the most prominent Muslim philosophers, thinkers. And before I start talking about him and his book, this is more about his book and less about him. I want to thank the Islamic Community Center of Lancaster, which is also hosting this show. So thank you very much for the community in Lancaster. Please don't forget to subscribe to Khanversations and also like the video and then press the bell icon. Ibn Khaldun is one of the most important, in my opinion, thinkers that the Islamic civilization has produced. He's remarkable because he was perhaps the first Muslim scholar, philosopher, who thought in empirical terms. So even though he was many things, he was a diplomat, he was like a national security advisor to many people. In fact, I can't think of any other example of a person who was both a diplomat and a national security advisor in 3 continents. Ibn Khaldun worked for monarchs in Africa, for monarchs in Europe, in Spain, both Muslim and Christians. He was offered a job by Pedro, and he did not take it. He was much appreciated in Seville, in the King of Seville in Spain, and he also worked in Asia. So he was a diplomat, a national security advisor on 3 continents. So Ibn Khaldun lived from around 1332 till about 1406 or 8. He lived in many parts. So he was born in Tunis. He ultimately died in Cairo. He had a successful career in Spain. He had a successful career to some extent in Damascus also. One of the more interesting things that comes out of his life is his encounter with Sultan Timur, the conqueror, and the discussions that they had, which he described in his biography in much detail. Very fascinating. Ibn Khaldun was important because today he's considered as the father of modern sociology. He's considered the father of modern economics, especially political economy. He is considered as the founder of the sciences of civilization. And he is also a major philosopher of history. Toynbee, a very prominent British scholar, considered Ibn Khaldun as one of the most prominent scholars of history ever. So Ibn Khaldun's contributions are in the field of philosophy, in the field of sociology, in the field of history, philosophy of history, in epistemology. And he was also a Maliki judge. So he was also an expert in Islamic jurisprudence. And so he was appointed the head of the Maliki courts in Egypt 6 times. He was fired 5 times, but he was appointed 6 times because of his expertise in that field. But unlike other Muslim thinkers who have allowed their legalistic and juristic and normative thinking to cloud everything else that they do, in fact, to the extent that they marginalized every other form of Islamic thinking, Ibn Khaldun did not do that. He studied philosophy and he studied history. And even though he was a jurist, he wrote like a philosopher, and he paid a lot of attention to empirical reality. He would not say, oh, this works because God said so. He would also look at their empirical examples. You know, his treatment of Al-Farabi's Madinatul Fadila, this virtuous republic that Al-Farabi was talking about. Ibn Khaldun basically said, I've never seen it exist anywhere in history. There is no empirical reality to this utopian philosophy, so there's really not much to talk about. But he's famous for several things. He wrote a great biography of himself, which is also historically very interesting, not only about his life, but about the Islamic kingdoms and geopolitics of North Africa, Syria, Central Asia, as well as Spain. But his most important book, which is Muqaddimah, this is, most of you in the West would have seen this. This is Muqaddimah. Muqaddimah means essentially introduction. This is introduction to his famous history, or world history, you could call it. It's called Kitab al-Ibar or Tariqat Ibn Khaldun. This is what it is in 7 volumes. I have 4 volumes here, and I also have 3 of them here. It's interesting that one of the things I noticed is that I've read these books several times, so you can see from different kinds of post-its. And it was very interesting for me also while I was preparing for this episode to see what in the books have I highlighted. So it is a bit of a learning about myself over the years, what I paid attention to and what I did not pay attention to. There are others who are interested, who have commented on it. My friend Farid Al-Attas, who is a descendant of Ibn Khaldun, who teaches in the National University in Singapore, wrote this beautiful book on Ibn Khaldun. It's very concise. It summarizes Ibn Khaldun's ideas in various fields, in sociology, in epistemology, in education, especially from Muqaddimah, and also has a small biography in it. Another scholar who is Yves Lacoste also wrote a very nice biography. I also had a very interesting discussion about Ibn Khaldun's life and his ideas a couple of years ago on Khanversation with Professor Dale, Stephen Dale, and you can see that conversation. I will post a link to it. I have several conversations on Ibn Khaldun and his ideas on Khanversations, and I will post the links to them in the description of the video so you can watch them for those of you who are interested in sociology, in philosophy of history, in civilizational discussions. For example, today we are talking about civilizational states like India, like China, like Russia. And so Ibn Khaldun's Ulum al-Umran, or the science of civilizations, can be very interesting way, a segue into discussions about civilizational states. I bought this Arabic version of Muqaddimah from a very beautiful store in Rabat while I was there in 2011 when I was studying Arabic. I spent several months, many months in Rabat, and so I've read this. This is one of the first books I've read in Arabic, and that was Muqaddimah. I consider Ibn Khaldun as one of the most prominent thinkers. And if you were to ask me who from the Islamic heritage is like a teacher to me, it's Ibn Khaldun. In my book on Islam and good governance, I have discussed some of his ideas. The thing that fascinated to me most about Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah his book. This is one of, in my opinion, easily the 10 best books written by Muslims in the last 1400 years, is the fact that he did not, unlike other normative thinkers, completely sideline empirical reality. He was willing to question. He paid a lot of attention to reason and rationality. One of the person who has appreciated that aspect of his work is Mohsin Mahdi, a former professor of Harvard. He also wrote a very good book on Ibn Khaldun's philosophy of history. Mohsin Mahdi was more or less a historian, but a political philosopher also. So Ibn Khaldun had a very interesting but tragic life, a very illustrious person, had great jobs, but some of his most prominent jobs, other than advising monarchs and training caliphs, was also being a professor in various universities, including Al-Azhar University in Cairo. He's considered, as I already said, the father of modern sociology, modern economics, and a philosopher of epistemology and history. In fact, there's a very interesting quote by President Ronald Reagan about Ibn Khaldun's discussion of the relationship between taxation and rate of growth of GDP. If I find it, I will share it with you.
I studied economics in college when I was young, and I learned there about a man named Ibn Khaldun, who lived 1,200 years ago in Egypt. And 1,200 years ago, he said, in the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, the tax rates were low, but the revenue was great. He said in the end of the empire, when the empire was collapsing, the rates were great and the revenue was low.
So Muqaddimah is this is the introduction to his global history that he's writing. There are some very interesting ideas. One of the most interesting ideas is how he sees the very progress of history. He sees history as a cyclical thing, history as something that is triggered by the emergence of solidarity or collective identity. He calls it Asabiyya. This is one of his most famous contributions. And in fact, the one that most people always talk about is Ibn Khaldun's concept of Asabiyya from Muqaddimah. So what he basically argues is that when you exist in the state of nature, like the Bedouins in the desert, state of nature is the condition in which you are living free without being subordinate or subject to any legal system or any political system or any polity. So if you are able to form a solidarity based on tribal equality or something, ethnicity, Ibn Khaldun basically looks at tribal connection, solidarity, and then later on talks about religion also serving as a source of solidarity or collective identity. Today we can see people talking about Jewish nationalism, that is Zionism, now talking about Christian nationalism, the rise of Christian nationalism in the West, rise of Hindu nationalism in India. Islamism has been around for over 100 years. These are also forms of Asabiyya. These are forms of bringing people together. So when shall we say, a phenomena or an Asabiyya occurs in history, it brings people together and they begin to act as a collective force. And that is where the beginning of civilization happens. They conquer and they establish, they create cities. It leads to urbanization. Urbanization leads to emergence of culture and civilization. And then he feels that once these people from the wild, from the state of nature, once they are basically tamed under the urban existence of culture, etc. He argues that that leads to weakening of that collective group, and they are potentially target for new emerging Asabiyyas. And so another new force can come and conquer them and replace them. So he sees history progressive in cycles, in the rise and fall of collective identities. Today, we could argue that the most modern equivalent of Asabiyya is nationalism. And so nationalism gives you that identity. It can be based on ethnicity, or it can be based on ideas and values, American identity and American Asabiyya is basically around constitution and the values that all Americans share, whereas European-style nationalism is based on shared history, shared language, shared ethnicity. So one of his ideas and his philosophy of history is about the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations and the role of collective identity in that. Another thing that Ibn Khaldun really brings forward in his discussion that I find fascinating is that I am a political theorist and I like to talk about political theories, is his discussion of three types of states. He talks about three types of states. He says states are natural, rational, and religious. Natural states are states where basically led by a leader or a king or a tribe, the early forms of Asabiyya. So you are the leader of a particular group, and the way you govern is essential to advance your self-interest. When the ruling elite, when the ruler makes decisions in order to maximize his or her wealth or maximize his or her own regime perpetuity or continuity. So that is the kind of natural kingdoms that he offers and talks about kingdoms around at that time where kings were only interested in their personal power, gaining power, retaining power, defending their control, maximizing their wealth. So these are glory hunting, wealth accumulating, power accumulating states. He uses the word dawla quite a bit. So he's talking about states also, not just kingdoms and dynasties. So they are, in his view, natural states. Then he talks about rational states. Rational states, he says, exist when the ruler or the ruling elite, and since he had accepted dynasties, so we're talking about essentially a ruler, when the ruler makes policies which are not only designed to perpetuate and defend his regime, but is also to provide public goods and benefits for the people. So especially material benefits, improve the quality of life, improve the GDP, improve the sanitation, security, wealth, education, even entertainment, because once you're urbanized and you're looking for high culture. So Ibn Khaldun identifies states and rulers who are also keeping an eye and pursuing the public goods for citizens of the state as essentially a rational state. So the state's interests are defined rationally, and they are pursued by the state. So he calls them rational states, and he says that more or less most states that occur in his time, in his nature, were either natural states or irrational states. And it was important that states move from being natural to rational because natural states are of no use to people who live in them. Rational states are what you want. And then he talks about religious states, and he says religious states are those states which are rational states in the sense that they are pursuing the material well-being of their citizens, security, welfare, prosperity, education, etc., but are also geared towards providing an environment which will enrich the citizens spiritually. So a religious state is one which is safeguarding the present or the life in the here and the life in the hereafter. So you are basically trying to make sure that your citizens live a moral life. This is where he comes very close to Farabi's virtuous republic, Madinatul Fadila, because that is what the purpose of the virtuous republic is, to create citizens whose souls are improved, spiritually enriched. So these are the three types of states he likes, and it's very clear that Ibn Khaldun does not see many religious states existing. He does talk about the time of the Prophet and the early caliphate, but there were none in his time that he really taught. He also advances the concept of good governance. And his idea of good governance was essentially to encourage both natural rulers and religious rulers, or rulers of the natural state and the religious state, to be kind, to be benign, to be compassionate, and to be soft in the way they deal with the citizen. So talking about a compassionate form of governance, which is recognizes the limits of the citizens and is generous and forgiving towards the citizens, was Ibn Khaldun's idea of good governance. Ibn Khaldun also talks about sociology. There are lots of interesting things that he talks about: the impact of weather, impact of climate, impact of different kinds of society. So there is a very profound discussion of sociological insights in the book, which not only reflect about the societies that he lived in, but also give you new ideas to think about. I'm not a sociologist, so I did not pay much attention to that part of the book. But I did go through his discussions on epistemology or sciences of knowledge. He's very profound. He writes a lot about it. And it's also very interesting that in the context of talking about epistemology or the theory of knowledge, he also talks about Sufism. And to me, that was very interesting. Both his father and his grandfather he comes from a very illustrious family from Spain, and they moved to Tunis where he was born. And I went to his memorial in Tunis, and as far as I know, there's only one statue of Ibn Khaldun. Shame on Muslims. There's only one statue or memorial of Ibn Khaldun in the entire world, and that is in Tunis. And I actually have a photograph that I took in front of Ibn Khaldun's statue in 2011. You're probably looking at it right now. So he grew up in Tunis, and his family was associated with various Sufi tariqas, and he himself was, to a great extent, a practitioner of Sufism, even though he was also very harsh, apparently, as a judge. And so people used to complain a lot that he was very severe. It's interesting that while he's talking about good governance, he's encouraging the ruler to be benign and kind. But when he was a judge, he tended to be very strict and he was very officious. He used to, dress in very Maghribi style from the part of the North Africa that he comes back. So it is an interesting way, the way he thought about knowledge and the way he talked about the role of epistemology. But the thing that is important is he was emphasizing constantly the important role of reason and the important role of history or empirical reality in knowledge production. And so to me, in that sense, he was very Aristotelian, and so therefore he is very unique. And it is a shame that while most people these days know of Ibn Khaldun, I'm constantly surprised when I travel across the Muslim world, when I meet traditional scholars, how few of them have actually read Ibn Khaldun. I think he should be a required reading everywhere in the world, whether they are Muslim universities or non-Muslim universities. Here, I teach Ibn Khaldun to my grad students at the university. There are so many courses. In America, there are hundreds of universities where Ibn Khaldun is read and taught, and there are literally thousands of dissertations done on Ibn Khaldun, and it's taught in Turkey and Turkish universities, especially now. Even Malaysians and Indonesians are paying attention to him. There is a lot of work in Arabic now that is being done on Ibn Khaldun and his book Muqaddimah. But most importantly, there is a new way of thinking about social sciences, which is emerging, which is kind of a subset of the decolonization approach, the decolonial approach to knowledge production, where people are talking about Ibn Khaldun. There's an Ibn Khaldun society in Turkey. I have had the honor of going to Turkey on several occasions to just talk about Ibn Khaldun at conferences which are just about Ibn Khaldun. And they are trying to build a social science based on Ibn Khaldun's methods. So it would be far more authentic to at least the Muslim world. There are some preliminary works coming out of it, but we'll see where that goes. I think social science is social science. Yes, you can borrow ideas from Ibn Khaldun, but at that time they were very unique, but some of the ideas that he has already are incorporated or exist or have received newer treatment in contemporary socio-political theory and philosophy of history. I want to share an episode with all of you. You all know about Dr. Ali Mazrui. He was a very famous African scholar, and he was, he worked both in England as well as here in the US. And And I had an opportunity of being on a panel with two giants, Sarif Mardin and Ali Mazrui. And these two people are very close to Ibn Khaldun's work. Ali Mazrui has passed away. May Allah have mercy on him. I think Sarif Mardin also probably has passed away, but this is about 7-8 years ago, 2015 in Istanbul. And so we were on this panel, and I was the first speaker. So this was a preliminary session at a conference on Ibn Khaldun, where I talked about Ibn Khaldun and his ideas and which part of those ideas are important and relevant. I spoke a lot about his ideas on good governance. And after I finished, Dr. Mazrui kind of criticized me by saying that Muqtedar has touched upon everything that needs to be said about Ibn Khaldun except one thing. He forgot to say that Ibn Khaldun is also one of the greatest scholars produced by Africa. So when we talk about Islam, Ibn Khaldun was an Islamic scholar, or contribution of Islamic civilization or Arab civilization. He was an Arab in an area and an era when Berbers were dominant, Berbers in Maghrib, northwestern Africa. We often forget that he was an African too. So in memory of Ali Mazrui, I wanted to share this moment with all of you that Ibn Khaldun was a great scholar. His impact is global and historical. He was very realist, if you know what I mean from an international relations perspective. He was a rationalist and empiricist, a philosopher, a historian, and sociology. This is one of the greatest books written by any Muslim in the last 1400 years. I recommend everybody should read this, or at least a smaller and easier version of it by my friend Sayyid Farid al-Attas. And I hope that at least American Muslims who are, alhamdulillah, well off should at least have Ibn Khaldun in their library. Hopefully one day you will read it. So I hope you found this discussion helpful, useful, and interesting. I will post links to some of these books and videos in the video description. And once again, Ramadan Mubarak to all of you. And if you have not subscribed to Khanversations, please subscribe to Khanversations, press the bell icon so that you get notification when I do the next great book from the Islamic heritage. And also don't forget to share this video with your socio-political network. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan.